Devil's Ridge had always been a place where people went to disappear. The jagged peaks and endless forest swallowed secrets whole, keeping them buried under layers of pine needles and morning fog. 4 years ago, Sarah Chen and Emma Rodriguez became 2 more names added to the mountain's grim collection. The search parties had combed every trail, every cave, every hidden ravine, but they never found the girls. They never found the cabin either. Jake Morrison knew these mountains better than anyone. Born and raised in their shadow, he could track a deer through a blizzard and find his way home in complete darkness. His grandfather had been the region's most respected tracker, teaching Jake skills that most people had forgotten existed, skills that made him the perfect person to stumble upon what everyone else had missed. When the sheriff found Jake 3 days later, he was sitting motionless in that forgotten cabin, eyes wide and unblinking, his mind shattered by whatever he'd witnessed inside those rotting walls. But what could possibly be so horrifying that it would break a mountain boy who'd seen death 100 times over? The morning Jake discovered the cabin started like any other. He'd been tracking an injured elk for 2 days, following a blood trail that wound deeper into the ridge than he'd ever ventured. His boots crunched through frost-covered undergrowth as dawn painted the sky a sickly yellow. The elk's trail had grown stranger the further it led him, not weaker but more frantic, as if the animal had been running from something rather than nursing its wound. Jake paused beside a lightning-split pine, studying the disturbed earth. The hoofprints were deep here, torn up in panic. But there were other marks too, drag marks in the dirt, smooth and deliberate, leading away from the elk's path toward a cluster of boulders he'd never noticed before. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When the forest starts telling a story you don't understand, boy, that's when you listen closest. The drag marks led him through a narrow gap between the boulders, revealing a hidden dell that shouldn't have existed. Maps of these mountains lived in Jake's head, passed down through 3 generations of Morrison men, but this hollow wasn't on any of them. Ancient pines formed a perfect circle around the clearing, their branches intertwined overhead like arthritic fingers, blocking out most of the morning light. And there, crouched in the center like a malignant tumor, sat the cabin. It was wrong from the first glance. The structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its weathered logs black with age and something else, something that made Jake's skin crawl. The windows were boarded up with planks that bore strange symbols carved deep into the wood, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Jake had grown up hearing stories about the old mountain folk, the ones who'd lived here before the settlements, before the roads. His grandmother used to whisper tales of rituals performed in hidden places, of bargains made with things that lived in the deep forest. He'd always figured they were just stories meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. Now, staring at those carved symbols, he wasn't so sure. The elk's trail ended at the cabin's front door. Just ended, as if the animal had simply vanished. But the drag marks continued up the porch steps, worn smooth by whatever had passed over them countless times. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. His grandfather had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming at him to turn around and run. But something else held him in place, a morbid curiosity, or maybe something more sinister, the kind of pull that drew moths to flames. The front door hung slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. As Jake approached, he caught a smell that made his stomach turn. Not death exactly, but something worse, something sweet and rotten and alive all at once. He pushed the door open with the tip of his boot, wincing at the prolonged creak that echoed through the dell. The sound seemed to wake something inside the cabin, though Jake couldn't say what made him think that. Just a subtle shift in the quality of the darkness beyond the threshold. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone in there?" Silence answered him, but it was the wrong kind of silence. The forest behind him had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind in the branches. Even his own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Jake stepped across the threshold. The floorboards sagged under his weight, creaking like old bones. Shafts of sickly light filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. The smell was stronger here, making his eyes water. And then he saw the photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of the cabin's walls. All of them showed the same thing, girls. Young girls hiking, camping, laughing around campfires, girls who looked happy and alive and utterly unaware they were being watched. At the center of the largest wall, he found the pictures that made his blood freeze. Sarah Chen and Emma Rodriguez captured in dozens of candid shots taken long before they disappeared. The coffee in Sheriff Margaret Torres's mug had gone cold hours ago, but she kept wrapping her fingers around the ceramic anyway, searching for warmth that wasn't there. The case files spread across her desk told the same story they'd been telling for 3 months. Nothing. 2 17-year-old girls had simply vanished into the mountain air like morning mist. Emma Caldwell and Sarah Chen, honor students, volleyball teammates, best friends since middle school, they'd driven up to Devil's Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, telling their parents they wanted to photograph the fall foliage for their senior art project. Emma's Honda Civic was found 2 days later in the parking area at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, their cameras and backpacks undisturbed in the back seat. Torres rubbed her eyes, feeling every one of her 48 years. In 23 years of law enforcement, she'd never had a case go this cold this fast. The state police had brought in search teams, dogs, even a helicopter. They'd combed every inch of the accessible trails and found nothing, not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single strand of hair snagged on a branch. The missing persons posters still hung in the diner windows downtown, their smiling faces growing more faded each week. Emma with her cascade of auburn curls and infectious grin, Sarah with her serious dark eyes and subtle smile. 2 futures erased without explanation. "Sheriff?" Deputy Jake Morrison knocked on her open door, his young face creased with concern. "You might want to take this call. It's Billy Hawthorne." Torres knew the name. Everyone in town knew Billy, though most preferred to pretend they didn't. The Mountain families had been up there for generations, living off-grid in cabins and trailers scattered through the higher elevations. They kept to themselves, traded pelts and moonshine, and generally wanted nothing to do with townfolk or their laws. Billy was different, though. He'd come down for school when he was younger before his grandfather pulled him back to the mountains permanently. She picked up the phone. "This is Sheriff Torres." "Ma'am." Billy's voice was tight, strained. "I'm calling from the payphone at Miller's Gas. You need to get up here, to the ridge." "What's wrong, Billy?" A long pause filled only by the static of the old landline. "I found something in one of the old cabins up past Widow's Point." Christ, I don't even know how to say this." Torres sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am, but you're going to want to bring the coroner, and maybe some of them state boys with the fancy equipment." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "This ain't natural, what I seen up there." 20 minutes later, Torres was following Billy's rusted pickup truck up the winding dirt road that led to the higher elevations of Devil's Ridge. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent behind the peaks, casting long shadows between the pines. She'd radioed for backup, but it would be another hour before anyone else could make it up the mountain. Billy stopped at what looked like nothing more than a deer trail cutting into the dense forest. He emerged from his truck moving like an old man, though Torres knew he couldn't be more than 25. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "About a quarter-mile up that trail," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Cabin's been abandoned since before I was born. Never had cause to go poking around in there before today. What made you go in?" Billy took a long drag, the smoke mixing with his visible breath in the cooling air. "Smell. Something died up there, and died hard. Figured maybe it was a bear or something. Thought I might salvage the hide." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Wish I'd just kept walking." They hiked in silence, boots crunching on fallen leaves. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare. Weathered logs black with age, windows dark as dead eyes, the front door hanging open on rusted hinges. The smell hit Torres when they were still 50 yards away. Death, yes, but something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Jesus, she muttered, pulling her jacket up over her nose. It's worse inside, Billy said. A lot worse. Torres approached the cabin with her hand resting on her service weapon, though she couldn't say what she expected to find. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped through the doorway, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the gloom. When they did, she wished they hadn't. The back wall was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping and pinned with rusted nails. Some looked decades old, others appeared recent. All showed the same thing, young women, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. And there, in the center of the collage like a crown jewel, were Emma Caldwell and Sarah Chen. The fluorescent lights in the sheriff's station hummed with an electric persistence that made Deputy Sarah Chen's temples throb. She'd been staring at the same 3 files for the past hour, cross-referencing incident reports with the growing pile of witness statements that all seemed to circle around the same maddening conclusion. Nobody had seen anything useful. Across the cramped office, Sheriff Tom Briggs nursed his 4th cup of coffee since dawn, his weathered face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from too many sleepless nights and too few answers. The disappearance of Emma Walsh and Katie Morrison had shaken Devil's Ridge to its core, and now with the Hendricks boys' discovery, the whole town felt like it was holding its breath. Medical examiner's preliminary report just came in, Sarah said, sliding a manila folder across Briggs' desk. The remains we found, they're not our girls. Briggs looked up sharply. What do you mean? Carbon dating puts them at least 50 years old, maybe older. 3 bodies total, all female, all between the ages of 15 and 20. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Tom, we're not dealing with a recent crime scene. We're dealing with something that's been going on for decades. The sheriff's coffee mug hit the desk with a sharp clink. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds, creating prison bars of light across the wall. Jesus Christ! You're telling me we've got a serial killer who's been operating in these mountains for half a century? Or had been operating? Sarah opened another file, revealing a collection of aged newspaper clippings. I spent the night going through the archives. Look at this. The headlines told a chilling story. Local girl vanishes during hiking trip, 1987. Search called off for missing teen, 1994. Another disappearance rocks Devil's Ridge, 2001. Each article featured a photograph of a young woman, their smiling faces frozen in time. Their eyes bright with the kind of hope that comes before the world shows you its teeth. Briggs studied the clippings with growing dread. How many? 17 cases over the past 60 years, all girls between 15 and 21. All last seen somewhere on or near Devil's Ridge. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The thing is, Tom, they all went missing during the same 2-week period. Every single year. The office fell silent except for the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights. Briggs reached for his coffee but found his hands were shaking slightly. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd seen plenty of darkness. But this felt different. This felt deliberate in a way that made his skin crawl. When? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Sarah met his eyes. Mid-October. The same time Emma and Katie disappeared. The same time every year for 6 decades. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Deputy Martinez poked his head in, his young face pale. Sheriff? Dr. Reeves is here about the Hendricks boy. Says it's urgent. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves entered the office like a woman carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. She was Devil's Ridge's only psychiatrist, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd seen her share of trauma cases. But the expression on her face suggested this was something beyond her usual experience. How's the boy? Briggs asked. That's what I need to discuss with you. Dr. Reeves set her briefcase on the desk and pulled out a digital recorder. "I've been working with catatonic patients for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Billy isn't just traumatized, he's actively fighting against remembering what he saw." She pressed play on the recorder. Billy Hendricks's voice emerged, small and broken. "They're not gone. They're not gone. They're waiting. They're all waiting." "He keeps repeating variations of this," Dr. Reeves explained. "But here's the disturbing part. When I showed him photographs of Emma and Katie, he became agitated and kept saying, 'Not yet, not yet,' as if their time hasn't come." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. "Time for what?" "I don't know, but there's something else." Dr. Reeves pulled out a sheet of paper covered in crude drawings. "He drew this during one of our sessions, said it was what he saw carved into the cabin wall." The drawing showed a series of symbols arranged in a circle with what appeared to be dates scratched beneath them. At the center was a crude representation of a tree, its branches reaching upward like grasping fingers. Briggs studied the drawing with mounting horror. "Doc, are you saying this kid saw some kind of ritual site?" "I'm saying that whatever Billy discovered in that cabin, it's connected to something much larger than two missing girls, something that's been happening in these mountains for a very long time." Dr. Reeves gathered her papers. "And if the pattern holds true, it's going to happen again. Soon." The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the room into momentary darkness before buzzing back to life. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed like dying insects as Detective Sarah Chen made her way toward room 314. She'd been called in at 2 a.m. after the night shift nurse reported that Tommy Briggs had finally spoken, his first coherent words in 3 days since they'd found him wandering the mountain roads, eyes vacant and clothes torn. Dr. Martinez met her outside the room, his expression grim. "He's been asking for someone named Rebecca," he said quietly, "over and over. Won't say anything else." Sarah's blood ran cold. Rebecca Mills, one of the missing girls. She peered through the small window into Tommy's room. The 17-year-old sat upright in bed, staring at the wall with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the white hospital sheets. "Has he said anything else about where he's been?" "Just fragments. Something about the waiting room, and they're still hungry. The psychiatrist thinks he's having some kind of psychotic break, but..." Dr. Martinez hesitated. "There's something else. We found traces of an unknown substance in his bloodstream, not a drug, something organic we can't identify." Sarah pushed open the door, the hinges creaking softly. Tommy's head snapped toward her with unnatural speed, his pupils dilated despite the bright room lighting. "Tommy, I'm Detective Chen. Can you tell me where you've been?" "They made me watch," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Rebecca." She tried to warn me, but her mouth... He stopped abruptly, pressing his palms against his temples. "God, the smell! It's still in my nose." Sarah pulled a chair closer to his bed, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Where did you see Rebecca, Tommy? Was Melissa with her?" At the mention of the second girl's name, Tommy began rocking back and forth. Melissa stopped screaming first. Rebecca lasted longer. They always do when they fight back. His eyes focused on Sarah with startling clarity. "You won't find them. Not the way they were." "What do you mean?" "Tommy, I need you to help me understand." "The cabin's not on any map," he interrupted. "It moves. Every time someone gets close, it moves deeper into the ridge. But once you're inside..." He laughed, a sound so devoid of humor it made Sarah's skin crawl. "Once you're inside, you're part of the collection." Sarah leaned forward. "What collection?" Tommy's trembling intensified. "He's been gathering them for decades. Girls who wander too far from the trails. Girls who think they're brave enough to explore Devil's Ridge alone." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But they're not alone in there. They're never alone." "Who, Tommy? Who's been taking them?" "Not who. What?" Tommy's eyes rolled back, showing only white. "It wears faces like masks. Sometimes it looks like a park ranger, sometimes a lost hiker calling for help. Rebecca thought she was helping someone when she went toward the tree line. The heart monitor began beeping frantically as Tommy's breathing became rapid and shallow. It keeps them fresh somehow, alive but not alive. Rebecca tried to tell me how long she'd been there, but her tongue... He gagged, doubling over. God, what it did to their tongues. Dr. Martinez burst through the door as alarms began sounding. "Detective, you need to leave. He's having another episode." But Tommy grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength, his fingers ice-cold against her skin. "Check the old mining records," he gasped. "Before Devil's Ridge got its name, before the first disappearances, find out what they were really digging for up there." Nurses flooded into the room, pushing Sarah aside as they worked to sedate Tommy. But his eyes remained locked on hers, and in them she saw a terror so profound it seemed to reach into her chest and squeeze her heart. "The basement," he managed to say as the sedative took hold. "Whatever you do, don't go into the basement. That's where it keeps the ones who tried to escape. That's where it showed me what happens when you disappoint it." His words slurred as consciousness slipped away. The dolls, all those beautiful dolls, still breathing. Sarah stood frozen as the medical team stabilized Tommy's vitals. The boy's final words echoed in her mind, mixing with fragments of witness statements and evidence reports. She thought about the hiking boots they'd found near Miller's Creek, Rebecca's boots, with no footprints leading away from them. She thought about Melissa, backpack, discovered hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, with no explanation of how it got there. As she walked back toward the elevator, Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the county records office. Mining records, Tommy had said. She glanced back at room 314 one more time, watching through the window as the sedated boy continued to mouth silent words. Even unconscious, he was still trying to warn her. The psychiatric ward at Millfield General smelled like disinfectant and despair. Detective Sarah Chen walked down the sterile hallway, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors. She'd been putting off this visit for 3 days, hoping Tommy Briggs might snap out of whatever psychological break he'd suffered. But according to Dr. Matthews, the boy hadn't spoken a single word since they brought him in. Sarah paused outside room 314, peering through the small window. Tommy sat rigid in a wheelchair beside the bed, staring at nothing. His hands gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The 17-year-old who'd once been known for his easy smile and quick wit looked like a hollow shell. "He's been like that since arrival," Dr. Matthews said, appearing beside her. "Catatonic state. Completely unresponsive to verbal stimuli. We've run every test imaginable. No signs of physical trauma, no evidence of drug use. Whatever happened to him was purely psychological. Can I try talking to him?" The doctor shrugged. "You're welcome to try, but I doubt you'll get through. His mind has essentially shut down to protect itself from whatever he experienced." Sarah entered the room quietly. Tommy didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't even blink when she pulled up a chair directly in front of him. His eyes remained fixed on some invisible horror only he could see. "Tommy, I'm Detective Chen. I know you can't respond right now, but I need you to know that we're looking for those girls, Emma Walsh and Jessica Martinez. If you found something up there, something that can help us bring them home, I need to know what it was." Nothing. Not even a flutter of recognition. Sarah tried a different approach. "Your mama's been here every day. She's worried sick about you, son. She brought you those comic books on the nightstand, the ones you love. Spider-Man, right?" Still nothing. For 20 minutes, Sarah talked about everything and nothing, the weather, the town gossip, even her own teenage years growing up in Millfield. Tommy remained as motionless as a statue, trapped somewhere deep inside his own mind. As she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something. Tommy's breathing had changed, becoming shallow and rapid. His grip on the wheelchair tightened even more, if that was possible. "Tommy, what is it?" Then she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, accompanied by a low, rhythmic tapping. An elderly patient shuffled past the door, using a wooden cane to steady himself. The sound was innocent enough, but Tommy's reaction was immediate and terrifying. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his entire body beginning to shake violently. "Nurse!" Sarah called out. rushing to Tommy's side. "I need help in here!" Dr. Matthews burst through the door with 2 nurses in tow. They quickly sedated Tommy, but not before Sarah saw something that chilled her to the bone. In those brief moments of terror, Tommy's eyes had focused. They'd been filled with a recognition so pure and primal that it spoke of unspeakable things. "What triggered that?" Dr. Matthews demanded, checking Tommy's vitals as the sedative took effect. The tapping sound. An old man's cane in the hallway. The doctor frowned. "Interesting. It's the first real response we've gotten from him. Whatever happened in that cabin, it involved something that made a similar sound." Sarah's mind raced. The crime scene photos from the abandoned cabin flashed through her memory. The overturned furniture, the strange markings carved into the walls, the trapdoor leading to a basement they still hadn't fully processed. She'd been focusing on the obvious evidence, but maybe she'd missed something auditory. "I need to get back up to Devil's Ridge," she told Dr. Matthews. "There's something we missed. Detective, I have to ask, have you found any trace of those missing girls yet?" Sarah shook her head grimly. "Not yet, but Tommy found something up there, something that broke his mind just from witnessing it. And I'm starting to think those girls might not be missing at all." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they might still be up there somewhere, and if they are—" Sarah looked at Tommy's unconscious form, now peaceful in forced sleep. "God help us all." She left the hospital with a new sense of urgency. The mountain was calling her back, and this time she wouldn't go alone. Whatever had shattered Tommy Briggs' sanity was still up there in those woods, still hidden in the shadows of Devil's Ridge. As Sarah drove toward the police station to gather her team, she couldn't shake the image of Tommy's terrified eyes when he'd heard that tapping sound. It reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. Something rhythmic and deliberate, like Morse code tapped out on wood, or like fingernails scratching against a basement door. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed like angry wasps as Detective Sarah Chen made her way toward room 314. Her footsteps echoed against the sterile linoleum, each step bringing her closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The coffee in her hand had gone cold hours ago, but she clutched the cup anyway, needing something solid to anchor her to reality. Dr. Martinez met her outside Billy's room, his expression grim. "He's been awake for 20 minutes, he said quietly. "But Detective, I have to warn you, whatever happened to him up there, it's left him deeply traumatized. He keeps asking for his sister, and when we tell him she's coming, he just shakes his head and says it's too late." Sarah peered through the small window in the door. Billy Hawthorne sat upright in the hospital bed, his wild hair now clean and combed, revealing a face far younger than his weathered hands suggested. His eyes darted constantly toward the window, as if expecting something to appear there. "Has he said anything about what he found?" "Fragments. Nothing coherent. He mentioned the girls several times and something about photographs, but every time we try to get him to elaborate, he becomes agitated." Sarah squared her shoulders. "I need to try." The door opened with a soft click, and Billy's head snapped toward her like a startled deer. His eyes were clear now, no longer clouded by whatever shock had claimed him in the woods, but what she saw there was worse than confusion. It was knowledge, terrible, unwanted knowledge that had carved itself into his soul. "Billy, I'm Detective Chen. I was hoping you could help me understand what happened up on the ridge." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're looking for them girls, ain't you? The ones from town?" "Yes, Emma Cartwright and Jessica Vale. Do you know something about them?" Billy's hands began to shake. He pressed them flat against the white hospital sheets, trying to still them. "I found their stuff in that cabin, but it ain't what you think." Sarah pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down, keeping her voice gentle. "What did you find, Billy?" "Pictures," he whispered. "Hundreds of them, but not normal pictures. They was all wrong, like someone had been watching them girls for months before they disappeared. Pictures of them at school, at the diner, even through their bedroom windows at night." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Was there anything else? Any indication of who might have been taking these photographs? Billy's breathing became rapid and shallow. There was writing on the walls, names and dates going back years. Not just them two girls, other names I recognized from town. Kids who went missing over the years, some so long ago I'd near forgotten about 'em. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, monitoring equipment beeping faster as Billy's heart rate spiked. "Detective, perhaps we should—" "No," Billy said, gripping the bed rail. "She needs to know." There was something else, something worse. Sarah leaned forward. What was it? In the back room there was this table, all covered with what looked like medical tools, but old ones, rusty. And underneath it, Billy's voice cracked. There was bones, detective, small bones, child-sized. The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of monitors. Sarah felt her stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Billy, this is very important. Did you see any sign that the girls might still be alive? Any recent evidence?" Billy's eyes filled with tears. "That's the worst part. There was fresh food in the cabin, canned goods that weren't dusty, and upstairs in what looked like a bedroom, there was girls' clothing, clean clothing, like someone had just laid it out. So whoever was using that cabin might still be active." "Detective," Billy said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, "I don't think it was just one person. I heard voices when I was coming down the mountain, multiple voices calling to each other through the trees. They was looking for me." Dr. Martinez checked his watch. "I really think that's enough for now. Mr. Hawthorne needs rest, and his sister should be arriving soon." As Sarah stood to leave, Billy grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were wide, urgent. "You can't go back up there alone. Whatever's happening on Devil's Ridge, it's bigger than just them two girls. It's been going on for years, and they got a system. They know them woods better than anyone." "Who, Billy? Who are they?" But Billy had already turned away, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "Just promise me you won't go up there alone. Promise me." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure Billy saw her. As she left the room, her mind raced with the implications of what she'd just heard. If Billy was right, Emma and Jessica hadn't simply wandered off or been taken by some opportunistic predator. They'd walked into something far more organized, far more sinister, and it was still operational. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed like trapped insects, casting an unforgiving glare over Detective Sarah Chen as she reviewed the case file one more time before entering Eli's room. 3 days had passed since the boy's discovery, and the doctors finally deemed him stable enough for questioning, though they warned his responses might be limited. Through the reinforced glass window, she could see Eli Morrison sitting upright in bed, his dark eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the far wall. His hands rested motionless on the white hospital blanket, but she noticed the way his fingers twitched whenever a shadow passed by the doorway. Dr. Patricia Reeves emerged from the room, clipboard in hand. "He's been like this since yesterday. Present but not present, if you understand. He'll respond to direct questions, but only briefly. And detective—" She paused, lowering her voice. "He keeps asking about locks, door locks, window locks. He's convinced something is trying to get in." Sarah nodded, though a chill ran down her spine. She'd seen trauma responses before, but something about this case felt different. The preliminary report from the crime scene team had been deliberately vague, noting only that disturbing materials had been found in the cabin. When she'd pressed for details, Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the boy, had simply handed her a sealed envelope and told her to read it after the interview. She pushed open the door, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Eli's head turned toward her, and for a moment she was struck by how young he looked, despite his 18 years. The mountain had aged him prematurely, but trauma had somehow reversed that, leaving him looking like the frightened child he'd probably never been allowed to be. "Eli, I'm Detective Chen. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what you found up on Devil's Ridge." His whole body tensed at the location's name. "You been up there?" "Not yet. Can you tell me about the cabin?" "Shouldn't go there." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Should burn it down. Should burn the whole damn ridge." Sarah pulled out her recorder and placed it gently on the bedside table. "What made you go inside?" Eli was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush. Door was open, just hanging there, creaking in the wind. Thought maybe someone needed help, you know. People get lost up there all the time, especially city folk who don't know the trails. And inside? His hands began to shake. The smell hit me first, sweet and sick, like flowers left too long in water, but underneath that was something else, something wrong. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What did you see, Eli? Pictures. The word came out strangled. Pictures everywhere. On the walls, scattered on tables, hanging from the ceiling on strings like some kind of sick mobile. But they weren't normal pictures. Pictures of what? Eli's breathing became rapid and shallow. A nurse appeared in the doorway, but Sarah held up a hand to keep her back. Take your time. The girls, Emma and Lily. But not like their missing posters. These were... He squeezed his eyes shut. These were different. Wrong, like someone had been watching them for a long time before they disappeared. Pictures of them sleeping in their beds, walking to school, sitting by their bedroom windows. Hundreds of them. Sarah's stomach dropped. A stalker case, then. But that didn't explain Eli's catatonic state. Was there anything else? Eli opened his eyes and looked directly at her for the first time. What she saw there made her want to leave the room immediately. The pictures weren't the worst part. What was? In the back room, there was this big wooden chest, old-fashioned, like a hope chest. It was locked, but the key was hanging right next to it on a nail. Like whoever put it there wanted someone to open it. Sarah waited, her pulse thundering in her ears. Inside were clothes, girls' clothes all folded neat and tidy, jeans and sweaters and... His voice cracked. And pieces, little pieces in glass jars with labels, hair ribbons, teeth, fingernails. He looked at her with haunted eyes. But, Detective, here's the thing that broke my brain. Those clothes, those pieces, they weren't just from Emma and Lily. What do you mean? The labels had names and dates going back 20 years. 20 years of girls who went missing on Devil's Ridge. Girls whose cases went cold. Girls everyone forgot about. Eli's voice dropped to barely audible, and at the very bottom of that chest was an empty jar with a fresh label, just waiting. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did the label say? Eli met her eyes, and in them she saw the terrible knowledge that had shattered his mind. It had my sister's name on it, Maya Morrison, dated for next week. The recorder continued its quiet humming as Sarah realized this case was far from over. It was just beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen reviewed Tommy Briggs' file for the third time that morning. 2 weeks had passed since the boy was found wandering the mountain trails, his clothes torn and his eyes vacant as broken windows. The psychiatric ward at St. Mary's Hospital had become his temporary home, though Sarah suspected it might be permanent if they couldn't break through whatever barrier his mind had constructed. She pushed through the heavy door to his room, clipboard in hand. Tommy sat on the edge of his bed, rocking slightly, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the white-painted walls. His lips moved constantly, forming silent words that never quite materialized into sound. "Good morning, Tommy," Sarah said, settling into the plastic chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling today?" The rocking continued. His fingers picked at the thin hospital blanket, pulling threads loose with mechanical precision. Sarah had tried everything, talk therapy, art therapy, even music therapy. The boy remained locked inside himself, a prisoner of whatever horror he'd witnessed in those woods. Sheriff Martinez had briefed her on the missing girls, Rebecca Chen and Holly Winters. Sarah shared no relation to Rebecca despite the surname, but the case had consumed the entire town. When Tommy was found, everyone hoped he might provide answers. Instead, he'd only deepened the mystery. "I brought something today," Sarah said, pulling out a sketch pad and colored pencils. "Sometimes it helps to draw what we can't say." Tommy's head turned slightly, the first voluntary movement she'd seen from him all week. His pale blue eyes focused on the paper, and something flickered behind them. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. She placed the pencils within reach. "Take your time." For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, with jerky, hesitant movements, Tommy's hand reached for a black pencil. His fingers wrapped around it with surprising strength, and he began to draw. The lines emerged chaotic at first, wild scribbles that covered the upper portion of the page, but gradually shapes formed. Sarah watched, fascinated and disturbed, as a crude building took form, a cabin with a peaked roof and a single door. The windows were nothing but black rectangles, darker than the spaces around them. Tommy's breathing grew rapid and shallow. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he pressed the pencil harder against the paper, the lead leaving deep grooves. He added details that made Sarah's stomach clench, symbols carved into the cabin's walls, strange markings that hurt to look at directly. "Tommy," she said softly, "you're safe here. You're safe." But he wasn't listening. His hand moved with frantic energy now, adding figures around the cabin. Two shapes that might have been girls, though their proportions were wrong, distorted. Their faces were smudged holes and their limbs bent at impossible angles. The pencil snapped under the pressure of his grip. Tommy stared at the broken pieces in his palm, and for the first time since his arrival, tears ran down his cheeks. "They're still there," he whispered, his voice like autumn leaves scraping across concrete. "They're still waiting." Sarah leaned forward, her heart hammering. "Who's still there, Tommy? Rebecca and Holly?" His head shook violently. "Not them. Not anymore. Something else. Something that wears their faces but isn't them. It showed me what it did to them, what it's been doing for years. The cabin isn't empty. It's full of things that used to be people." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if a dam had burst inside his mind. "I went looking for my dog. Rusty ran off into the woods, and I followed his barking. But when I got to the cabin, there was no dog. Just laughter. Girls' laughter coming from inside." Sarah's pen moved across her notepad, capturing every word. She'd interviewed dozens of trauma victims, but something about Tommy's account felt different, more real than the delusions she usually encountered. "I looked through the window," Tommy continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They were dancing. Rebecca and Holly, but not Rebecca and Holly. Their skin was grey and their eyes were black holes, and they moved like marionettes on strings. Behind them, in the shadows, I saw the others. Dozens of them, all dancing the same dance." He grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. It saw me watching, the thing controlling them. It smiled with Rebecca's mouth, but the teeth were too sharp, too many. It beckoned me inside, and I almost went. I wanted to dance with them, to join the collection. "What stopped you?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The real Rebecca," Tommy said. "Just for a second, I saw the real her trapped behind those black eyes. She mouthed one word, 'Run.' So I did. I ran until my legs gave out, and even then I kept crawling. But I can still hear the music they dance to. It never stops." Outside the window, clouds gathered over Devil's Ridge, and Sarah wondered if anyone would believe what she'd just heard. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed like dying insects as Detective Sarah Chen made her way toward room 314. 3 days had passed since they'd found Tommy Haskell crouched in that cabin, and the boy hadn't spoken a single word. Dr. Martinez had warned her that pushing too hard might cause permanent psychological damage, but Sarah was running out of options. The media was breathing down her neck, and the families of the missing girls deserved answers. She paused outside Tommy's room, watching through the small window as he sat motionless in his bed, staring at the wall with those hollow, frightened eyes. Whatever he'd seen in that cabin had broken something fundamental inside him. The nurses said he wouldn't eat unless they fed him like a child, and he flinched violently whenever anyone touched him unexpectedly. "Detective Chen?" Dr. Martinez approached from behind, his clipboard clutched against his chest. "I really must advise against another interview attempt. The boy is extremely fragile." Sarah turned to face the psychiatrist. "Doctor, 2 girls are still missing. Tommy might be our only link to finding them alive. Or finding their remains." Dr. Martinez said quietly. Have you considered that what he witnessed might have been their deaths? The trauma indicators suggest he experienced something catastrophic. The detective's stomach twisted, but she pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to think like that yet. 5 minutes. That's all I need. Dr. Martinez sighed and opened the door. Tommy's head snapped toward them with predatory alertness, his eyes wide and unblinking. For a moment, Sarah saw something almost feral in his expression before it dissolved back into vacant terror. Tommy? Sarah pulled a chair close to his bed, moving slowly. It's Detective Chen. We spoke before, remember? I just want to ask you a few questions. The boy's breathing quickened, his hands gripping the hospital blanket so tightly his knuckles went white. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish drowning in air. You don't have to talk about what you saw inside, Sarah said gently. Just help me understand how you found the cabin. Were you hunting? Exploring? Tommy's eyes darted to the window, then back to her face. His lips moved, forming silent words that Sarah couldn't decipher. Take your time, she encouraged, leaning closer. They weren't... Tommy's voice came out as barely a whisper, cracked and hoarse from disuse. Dr. Martinez moved forward, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. They weren't what, Tommy? The boy's whole body began to shake. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he struggled to form the words. They weren't the girls anymore. Sarah's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Were they hurt? Were they... Tommy's voice cracked into a scream that sent chills down Sarah's spine. They weren't human. They were wearing their faces, but they weren't... He dissolved into hysterical sobbing, his words becoming unintelligible. Dr. Martinez rushed forward, signaling to a nurse for sedation. That's enough, detective. You need to leave. But Sarah couldn't move. The implications of what Tommy had said crashed over her like a cold wave. She thought about the strange symbols carved into the cabin walls, the peculiar arrangement of bones and debris they'd found, the way the entire scene had felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Tommy, listen to me, she said urgently, as the nurse prepared a syringe. Where are the real girls? Are they still alive? The boy looked at her with desperate clarity for just a moment. The root cellar, he gasped, under the cabin. But don't go alone, don't trust anyone who's been up there. They can look like anyone now. The sedative took hold, and Tommy's eyes rolled back as he slumped against his pillow. Dr. Martinez shot Sarah an angry look, but she was already moving toward the door, her mind racing. In the parking lot, Sarah sat in her patrol car with the engine running, trying to process what she'd heard. Tommy's words echoed in her head. They weren't human. It sounded like the ravings of a traumatized teenager, but something deep in her gut told her there was truth buried in his terror. She pulled out her phone and called her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez. It went straight to voicemail. Strange, Mike always answered when she called. She tried the station instead. Rodriguez? He called in sick this morning, Sergeant Williams told her. Said he was feeling under the weather. You want me to patch you through to his home? Sarah's hands began to tremble as she remembered Mike's behavior after they'd processed the cabin scene. How quiet he'd become. How he'd insisted they shouldn't bring in outside help. How he'd volunteered to go back and check for additional evidence. No, she whispered into the phone. That's okay. She ended the call and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Tommy's warning rang in her ears. Don't trust anyone who's been up there. The basement beneath the cabin stretched further than Sheriff Reynolds had expected, its stone walls seeping with decades of accumulated moisture. The beam of his flashlight carved through the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor that seemed to tunnel directly into the mountain itself. Detective Martinez followed close behind, her breathing shallow in the stifling air. This place has been here a long time, Martinez whispered, running her fingers along the rough-hewn stones. These walls, they're not recent construction. Reynolds nodded grimly. The deeper they ventured, the more convinced he became that they were walking into something far older and more sinister than a simple kidnapping case. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger with each step, mixing with an underlying sweetness that made his stomach churn. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, and both officers stopped dead in their tracks. The room was circular, its walls lined with what appeared to be old mining equipment from the early 1900s, but it was the center of the room that commanded their attention. A raised stone platform, stained dark with substances Reynolds didn't want to identify. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed, her flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the scene. Scattered around the platform were personal items, jewelry, clothing fragments, and what looked like driver's licenses and school ID cards. Reynolds crouched down and picked up a silver bracelet with shaking hands. The engraving was still legible. "Happy 16th birthday, Emma." "That's Emma Hartwell's," he said, his voice barely audible. "Her mother showed me this exact bracelet when they filed the missing person report." Martinez was examining something else, a leather-bound journal lying open on a crude wooden table. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with spidery handwriting that seemed to dance in the flashlight beam. "Sheriff, you need to see this," she called softly. "This journal, it goes back decades, maybe longer." Reynolds joined her, and together they read the cramped entries. The dates jumped around: 1987, 1993, 2001, 2005, but the content was sickeningly consistent. Detailed descriptions of rituals, of offerings and communion with the mountain spirits, names and descriptions that matched missing person reports going back 40 years. "The mountain demands its due," Martinez read aloud from a particularly disturbing entry dated just 3 months ago. "The girls came willingly in the end, understanding their purpose. The transformation is nearly complete. Soon the old ways will return to Devil's Ridge, and the faithful will be rewarded." A sound echoed from deeper in the chamber, a soft scraping, like fingernails against stone. Both officers drew their weapons, flashlights cutting through the darkness toward the source of the noise. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a curtain of rotting fabric, was another opening. The scraping sound came again, followed by what might have been a whispered voice. "Help!" Reynolds felt his blood freeze. "Did you hear that?" Martinez nodded, already moving toward the opening. "Someone's down here. Someone's still alive." They pushed through the fabric barrier into a smaller chamber, and the sight that greeted them would haunt Reynolds for the rest of his life. 3 figures huddled against the far wall, chained iron rings embedded in the stone. Their hair was matted, their clothes torn and filthy, but they were breathing. "Emma? Sarah?" Reynolds called out, hardly daring to hope. One of the figures raised her head, and even through the grime and exhaustion, he could see it was indeed Emma Hartwell. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They held a glassy, unfocused quality that spoke of trauma beyond imagination. "He's coming back," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming. "He's always coming back. We tried to run, but the mountain won't let us leave. We belong to it now." Martinez was already on her radio, calling for backup and medical assistance, while Reynolds knelt beside the girls, checking their restraints. The chains were old but solid, requiring bolt cutters to remove. "Who did this to you?" he asked gently. "Who brought you here?" The third figure, a girl he didn't recognize but who appeared to be several years older than Emma and Sarah, laughed bitterly. "You think it's just one person? This place, it's been feeding on us for generations. The families on the mountain, they take turns. They choose the offerings." Reynolds felt the world tilt beneath him. "Families? How many people are involved in this?" "Half the town knows," the older girl continued, her voice gaining strength. "The mayor, the banker, some of the police, they're all part of it. The mountain protects their secrets, and they feed it what it wants." The sound of footsteps echoed from the main chamber, and Reynolds spun around, weapon raised. But the voice that called out was Deputy Morrison's. "Sheriff, we've got the area secured, but there's something else you need to know. We found Tom Briggs's truck about a mile up the mountain. He never left Devil's Ridge." Detective Sarah Chen stared at the photographs spread across her desk, each one more disturbing than the last. The crime scene team had worked through the night documenting every inch of the cabin, and what they'd found defied rational explanation. She picked up the photo of the basement wall where symbols had been carved deep into the wood, symbols that matched the ones found etched into Tommy Brennan's arms. The boy remained in the psychiatric ward, trapped in his catatonic state. Dr. Martinez had tried every technique she knew, but Tommy's mind had retreated so far inward that she wondered if he'd ever find his way back. The only response they'd gotten was yesterday, when a nurse accidentally dropped a metal tray. Tommy had screamed for 17 minutes straight before falling silent again. Sarah's phone buzzed. "Chen here. Detective, this is Officer Walsh. We've got something at the cabin. You need to see this." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood in the basement of the Nightmare House, watching forensic specialist Rick Novak carefully extract something from beneath the floorboards. The smell down here was worse today, a sickly sweet rot that made her eyes water despite the industrial fans they'd brought in. "Found it about an hour ago," Rick said, his voice muffled by his respirator mask. "There's a whole cache hidden under here." He pulled out a small wooden box, its surface black with age and carved with the same symbols that covered the walls. Sarah snapped on latex gloves and opened the box. Inside, nestled in moldy fabric, lay a collection of items that made her stomach turn. Hair ribbons, a class ring, a silver bracelet with Emma engraved on it, and photographs, dozens of them, dating back what looked like decades. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, flipping through the images. Young girls, all of them, ranging in age from what appeared to be 12 to 18. Some were candid shots taken from a distance, others were more intimate, suggesting the subjects knew their photographer. The final photos in the stack were different, darker, more disturbing. Girls who looked drugged or unconscious, positioned in ritualistic poses. "There's more," Rick said grimly. He pulled out a leather journal, its pages brittle and yellowed. "This goes back to 1987, maybe earlier." Sarah opened the journal carefully. The handwriting was cramped and erratic, filled with dates, names, and descriptions that made her skin crawl. The entries read like a hunting log. April 3rd, 1989. Blonde. 16, fights too much. Disposed of in the North Ravine. June 12th, 1991. Brunette. 14, perfect for the ceremony. She understood in the end. "How many?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Rick was quiet for a moment, counting through the evidence bags. "Based on what we've found so far, at least 23 different girls over the past 35 years. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 23 families who'd lost their daughters, 23 missing person cases that had gone cold. She thought about the Hendricks family, about the way Mrs. Hendricks still left Emma's bedroom exactly as it had been 2 years ago, waiting for her daughter to come home. "There's something else," Rick said, pulling out a final item from the hidden compartment. It was a VHS tape, unmarked except for a date written in the same cramped handwriting, October 13th, 2022. The date meant nothing to Sarah until she checked her notes. Emma Hendricks and Chloe Martinez had disappeared on October 15th, 2022, 2 days after whatever was on this tape. "We need to view this immediately," she said, her voice tight. An hour later, Sarah sat in the station's AV room with Sheriff Morrison and DA Patricia Wells. The television screen flickered to life, and Sarah immediately wished she'd prepared herself better for what they were about to see. The footage was grainy and handheld, showing the cabin's basement from the killer's perspective. 2 girls sat bound to chairs in the center of the room, Emma and Chloe, very much alive but terrified beyond comprehension. A man's voice spoke from behind the camera, low and measured, explaining his process in clinical detail. Sarah forced herself to keep watching as the man performed what he called a purification ritual, carving symbols into the girls' arms while they screamed. He spoke to them constantly, telling them they were chosen, that their fear was necessary for something greater than themselves. The tape ended abruptly with the man setting down the camera. The final shot showed Emma and Chloe still alive, still conscious, their eyes wide with terror as footsteps approached from off-screen. "Turn it off," Wells said quietly. She was pale, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. Sheriff Morrison stood up slowly. We need to find these girls' remains. Their families deserve that much. Sarah nodded, but something nagged at her. The tape had ended too soon, too suddenly, almost as if the killer had been interrupted. And if Tommy Brennan had stumbled into this cabin just 3 days ago, screaming about something that left him catatonic with fear, what exactly had he seen? The terrible possibility crept into her mind. What if the girls weren't dead at all? The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor cast everything in a sickly pallor as Detective Sarah Chen walked beside Dr. Martinez toward Tommy Whitaker's room. 3 days had passed since they'd found him in that cabin, and the boy hadn't spoken a word. His eyes remained fixed on some invisible horror that only he could see. "Any change?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the doctor's grim expression. "Nothing. We've tried everything. Sedatives, therapy, even brought his mother in. It's like he's trapped somewhere we can't reach." Dr. Martinez paused outside the door. "Detective, I have to ask, what exactly did you find in that place?" Sarah's jaw tightened. The official report was sanitized, clinical. It mentioned the photographs, the personal effects of the missing girls, evidence of prolonged captivity. But it didn't capture the true horror of what they'd discovered. The smell that had made seasoned officers vomit, the walls covered in desperate scratches, some spelling out words that still haunted her sleep, the basement room with its collection of teeth arranged in neat little rows. "Nothing a 16-year-old should ever see," she replied. Through the door's small window, Sarah could see Tommy sitting upright in bed, his thin frame dwarfed by the hospital gown. His dark hair hung lank across his forehead, and his lips moved constantly in what appeared to be a silent conversation with someone only he could perceive. Has he said anything at all? Even a whisper? Dr. Martinez shook his head. "The nurses report he sometimes appears to be responding to voices, but we can't make out any actual words. It's possible his mind has simply retreated." Sarah pushed open the door, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital room couldn't quite mask something else, a faint odor of pine and decay that seemed to follow Tommy wherever he went. She'd noticed it the day they found him, as if the cabin's corruption had seeped into his very pores. "Tommy?" She approached the bed slowly, keeping her voice gentle. "I'm Detective Chen. I was hoping we could talk." The boy's eyes flickered toward her for just a moment before darting away to focus on the corner of the room. His lips continued their silent movement, and Sarah caught herself straining to hear words that weren't there. She pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Tommy, I know what you saw was terrible, but we need to understand what happened to those girls. Can you help us?" For several minutes, there was only the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the soft whisper of Tommy's breathing. Then, so quietly, Sarah almost missed it, came a single word. "Hungry." Dr. Martinez stepped forward, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. She leaned closer to Tommy. "What's hungry, Tommy?" The boy's head turned slowly until he was looking directly at her. His eyes, which had seemed vacant moments before, now held a terrible clarity. "They're so hungry," he whispered, his voice raw from disuse. "Been hungry for so long." "Who, Tommy? Who's hungry?" "The girls, but they're not girls anymore." His hands began to shake, clutching at the bedsheets. "They took me down there, to the deep room, showed me what he did to them, what he made them become." Sarah's blood ran cold. The basement of the cabin had been thoroughly searched. They'd found evidence of the girls' imprisonment, but no bodies. The assumption had been that their captor had disposed of them elsewhere. "Tommy, the girls are gone. Whatever you think you saw—" "No." The word exploded from him with such force that Dr. Martinez stepped back in alarm. "They're still there, still in the walls, in the wood, in the ground underneath. He fed them to the mountain, piece by piece, and now they're part of it." The boy's breathing became rapid and shallow. "They whispered to me, told me how it felt when the knife went in, how they screamed until their voices broke. They showed me the room under the room, where he keeps the parts he couldn't use." Sarah felt her own hands beginning to tremble. "Tommy, who did this? Who took the girls?" "The keeper," Tommy said, his voice dropping to barely audible. He tends the mountain's hunger, feeds it what it needs, and now, his eyes widened in terror, now it knows I've seen, it knows I told. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah glanced at the window and saw that outside, despite the afternoon sun, shadows were gathering around the hospital like living things. "The mountain remembers everything," Tommy continued, his gaze fixed on something behind Sarah's shoulder. "Every drop of blood, every scream, every prayer. And it's still so very, very hungry." A low rumble echoed through the hospital, too deep to be thunder, too sustained to be anything natural. In the distance, Devil's Ridge loomed against the darkening sky, its peaks shrouded in clouds that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The basement of the Millbrook house stretched deeper than Sheriff Brennan had expected, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the foundation. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls that glistened with moisture, and something else, dark stains that made his stomach clench. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Martinez whispered behind him, her voice echoing in the confined space. They'd found the entrance behind a false wall in what had once been Thomas Millbrook's study. The wooden panel had swung inward at Brennan's touch, revealing crude stone steps that descended into blackness. The air that wafted up carried the metallic tang of old blood and something sweeter, more rotten. Each step down felt like descending into hell itself. The walls bore scratches, some made by tools, others that looked disturbingly like fingernails. Brennan forced himself to keep moving, though every instinct screamed at him to run back up those steps and into the clean mountain air. At the bottom, his flashlight revealed a chamber roughly 15 feet square. The floor was dirt, packed hard and stained dark in several places. Iron rings had been driven into the stone walls, and from them hung lengths of rusted chain, but it was the far corner that made Brennan's blood freeze. A wooden desk sat against the wall, and on it lay an open journal. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting in faded ink. Brennan approached it slowly, Martinez close behind him, both of them breathing through their mouths to avoid the stench. The first entry was dated 43 years ago. "Subject exhibits remarkable resilience. The cellular regeneration occurs within hours of tissue damage. Must determine if this trait can be transferred to other specimens." Brennan's hands shook as he turned the page. The entries continued, each one more horrifying than the last. Millbrook had been documenting experiments, tortures, on living subjects. The clinical tone made it somehow worse than if he'd written like a madman. "The healing ability appears to be triggered by extreme trauma. Subject 3 required amputation to test limits of regeneration. Limb regrew completely within 72 hours. Sheriff." Martinez's voice was barely a whisper. She was standing near one of the walls, shining her flashlight on something carved into the stone. "Look at this." Brennan walked over, still clutching the journal. The beam revealed names scratched into the rock, some so old they were barely legible, but two near the bottom made his heart stop: Emma Chen and Zara Walsh. Below their names, in fresher scratches, were others he didn't recognize. The carving was crude, desperate, as if made by fingernails or broken rock. Some names were accompanied by dates, but the dates spanned decades. That was impossible. No one could survive down here for decades. Unless... Brennan looked back at the journal, flipping through pages of increasingly frantic entries. Millbrook's handwriting became more erratic as the years progressed, his experiments more extreme. He wrote about subjects who wouldn't die, who healed from injuries that should have been fatal. He called them his angels, beings caught between life and death, sustained by something he never fully understood. "The transformation is irreversible," one entry read. "Once begun, the subject exists in a state of perpetual regeneration. They cannot die, but neither can they truly live. I have created something beautiful and terrible." The final entries were nearly illegible, scrawled in what might have been blood rather than ink. Millbrook wrote about losing control of his subjects, about them becoming something beyond his understanding. The last coherent sentence chilled Brennan to the bone: "They have begun to change others." God help me. They have learned to spread the gift. Sheriff, Martinez called out again, this time from the opposite wall. There's another passage here. Brennan looked up to see her examining what appeared to be a natural fissure in the rock, wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cold air flowed from within, carrying sounds that might have been wind or breathing. He closed the journal and approached the opening. His flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet into the passage before being swallowed by absolute darkness. But in that brief illumination, he saw something that made his knees nearly buckle. Footprints in the dirt, recent ones. Small, like those made by teenage girls. The sounds from within the passage grew louder, a rhythmic scraping, like someone dragging themselves across stone, or something dragging multiple someones. The footprints led deeper into the mountain, toward Devil's Ridge, where this nightmare had begun. Brennan realized with growing horror that the cabin where they'd found Jacob Fletcher wasn't the end of this story, it was just the beginning. Whatever Millbrook had created down here had survived his death, had continued to exist in the dark spaces beneath the mountain. And now Emma and Sarah were part of it. The scraping sounds grew closer, accompanied now by a sound that might have been whispering. Multiple voices speaking in unison, calling out from the darkness beyond. They were coming back. The basement stretched deeper than Jake had imagined possible, carved from the living rock of Devil's Ridge itself. Detective Sarah Chen followed close behind, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The air grew thicker with each step downward, heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something organic and wrong. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above their footsteps. The wooden stairs creaked ominously beneath their weight, each board threatening to give way and send them tumbling into the abyss below. Sarah's light caught something ahead, a doorway, but not like any door she'd ever seen. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The wood was dark, almost black, and appeared to be weeping some kind of viscous substance that pooled at its base. "We should wait for backup," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they couldn't. Whatever was happening here had been going on for decades, maybe longer. Every moment they delayed could mean another life lost. Jake reached for the door handle, a twisted piece of metal that looked more like bone than iron. The moment his fingers made contact, the door swung open silently, revealing a chamber that defied all logic and reason. The room beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that their flashlights couldn't penetrate. Along the walls stood dozens of glass containers, each one filled with a murky, amber-colored fluid, and floating inside each container. Sarah's stomach lurched as her light revealed the truth. Body parts, organs, pieces of human beings preserved in whatever hellish solution filled those jars. But these weren't the random trophies of a serial killer. They were arranged with purpose, labeled with careful handwriting on yellowed tags. Lung capacity enhancement, subject 23. Bone density modification, subject 31. Neural pathway reconstruction, subject 45. Jake stumbled backward, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "What the hell is this place?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard it, a sound that made their blood freeze. Singing, a young girl's voice, sweet and clear, drifting from somewhere deeper in the chamber. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something wrong with it, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. They moved toward the sound, their lights revealing more horrors with each step. Operating tables stained dark with blood, surgical instruments that looked more like medieval torture devices, and books, thick, leather-bound volumes, written in languages that predated human civilization. The singing grew louder as they approached another doorway, this one smaller and partially hidden behind a curtain of what looked like human skin. Sarah pushed it aside with the barrel of her gun, fighting back the urge to vomit. Beyond the curtain lay a circular chamber with a domed ceiling covered in more of those painful symbols. In the center stood an altar, and on it, chained by wrists and ankles, lay a young girl. But this wasn't one of the missing teenagers from the recent disappearances. This girl was different. Her skin had an unnatural pallor, almost translucent, and beneath it, Sarah could see a network of dark veins that pulsed with their own rhythm. The girl's eyes were closed as she sang, her voice never wavering despite the obvious pain she was in. "Emma?" Jake whispered, recognizing something in the girl's features despite the horrific changes. "Emma Rodriguez?" The singing stopped abruptly. The girl's eyes snapped open, revealing pupils that reflected their flashlight beams like an animal's. When she smiled, Sarah saw that her teeth had been filed to points. "You shouldn't have come here," the girl said, her voice still melodious but now carrying an undertone of something predatory. "The doctor doesn't like visitors." "Emma, we're here to help you," Sarah said, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "We're going to get you out of here." The girl laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Get me out? You don't understand. I don't want to leave. None of us do. The doctor made us better, stronger, perfect." That's when Sarah noticed the other alcoves around the chamber's perimeter. In each one stood a figure, teenagers, both male and female, all bearing the same pale skin and dark-veined appearance. Their eyes reflected the light as they watched the intruders with predatory interest. "The doctor said new subjects would come eventually," Emma continued, her smile widening. "He's been preparing for you." The sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, heavy, measured steps descending the basement stairs. Sarah spun around, her gun drawn, but the doorway they'd entered through was now blocked by more of the pale teenagers. "Welcome to my laboratory," a cultured voice said from the shadows. "I've been waiting such a long time for new specimens." The basement beneath the cabin stretched further than Marcus had imagined possible. What he'd initially thought was a simple root cellar revealed itself to be an elaborate network of tunnels carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness ahead as he followed the narrow passage, his breathing shallow and rapid. The walls bore strange markings, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing light. Some appeared to be carved, others looked burned into the stone itself. Marcus tried not to focus on them, but they seemed to pull at his peripheral vision, demanding attention he refused to give. 20 feet ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the basement above, but far more disturbing. The floor was covered in a thick layer of what looked like ash, though it gave off a sweet, cloying scent that made his stomach turn. In the center of the room sat an ornate chair, its high back carved with the same writhing symbols that adorned the walls, but it wasn't empty. The figure in the chair had once been human, though time and something else entirely had transformed it into something Marcus's mind struggled to process. The skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing the network of veins beneath. The eyes were gone, replaced by dark hollows that somehow still seemed to track his movement. Most disturbing of all, the chest still rose and fell with a barely perceptible rhythm. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice didn't come from the thing in the chair. Marcus spun around to find Dr. Helen Marsh emerging from another tunnel he hadn't noticed. She looked different, older, more haggard, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible knowledge. "Dr. Marsh, what are you doing here? What is this place?" She moved closer, her footsteps unnaturally quiet on the ash-covered floor. "This is where it all began, Marcus, long before Sarah and Emma disappeared. Long before your mountain boy found that cabin. This has been going on for decades." Marcus backed away, his light swinging between the psychiatrist and the thing in the chair. "You're involved in this. You've been involved from the beginning." "Involved?" Helen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I've been trying to stop it. Do you think I wanted to spend the last 15 years of my life chasing shadows and madness? Do you think I chose this?" The figure in the chair made a sound, not quite a moan, not quite a whisper. Helen glanced at it with a mixture of revulsion and pity. "That was Dr. James Whitmore," she continued. "He was the town psychiatrist before me. He discovered this place in 1987 when 3 teenagers went missing. He thought he could understand it, control it somehow. He was wrong. Marcus felt his grip tighten on the flashlight. Control what? The hunger. The thing that lives in these mountains, that feeds on fear and pain and the slow dissolution of human minds. It's ancient, Marcus. It was here when the first settlers arrived, and it'll be here long after we're all gone. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus could see his breath now, small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the stale air. The girls, he whispered. Sarah and Emma. Are they alive? Yes, but not in any way that matters. Helen's voice cracked slightly. It doesn't kill them, you see. It keeps them, feeds off their terror, their despair, slowly transforms them into something else entirely. Marcus thought of the mountain boy, Tommy Brewster, sitting catatonic in his hospital bed, the things he must have seen, the horrors that had broken his young mind so completely that he couldn't even speak. We have to get them out, Marcus said. We have to. There is no getting them out, Helen snapped. Don't you understand? This thing doesn't just take bodies, it takes souls. It burrows into your mind and makes you part of itself. The girls you're looking for don't exist anymore. The thing that had been Dr. Whitmore stirred in its chair, head turning slightly toward their conversation. When it opened its mouth, no sound emerged, but Marcus could see something moving inside, something that wasn't quite tongue, wasn't quite tentacle. Then why are you here? Marcus demanded. If there's nothing we can do, why did you come? Helen reached into her jacket and pulled out a device Marcus didn't recognize, something that looked like a cross between a radio and a grenade. Red lights blinked along its surface in a steady, hypnotic pattern. Because sometimes, she said quietly, the only way to save people is to make sure the thing hunting them can never hunt again. The basement began to shake, dust and small rocks falling from the ceiling. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow with their own internal light, pulsing in rhythm with Helen's device. In the distance, from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, came the sound Marcus had been dreading, the sound of footsteps moving steadily toward them. The basement door groaned open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. Detective Sarah Chen's flashlight beam cut through the black void, illuminating wooden steps that looked ready to collapse under the slightest weight. Behind her, Dr. Marcus Webb clutched a digital recorder, his hands trembling as they prepared to descend into what had driven Tommy Briggs into catatonic silence. The girls have to be down there, Sarah whispered, though part of her hoped they wouldn't find what she feared they would. The smell rising from below was wrong, a mixture of dampness, decay, and something else she couldn't identify. Something organic and putrid that made her stomach clench. Each step creaked ominously as they descended. The basement was larger than the cabin above suggested, carved deep into the rocky foundation of Devil's Ridge. Sarah's light swept across the space, revealing makeshift shelving units lined with glass jars. As they drew closer, the contents became horrifyingly clear. Preserved organs floated in yellowish liquid. Hearts, kidneys, sections of brain tissue, all meticulously labeled with dates going back 15 years. But it was the smaller jars that made Sarah's blood freeze. Tiny hands, locks of hair tied with ribbons, and teeth arranged in neat rows like grotesque pearls. Before Sarah could answer, her flashlight beam found something that made her stumble backward. In the far corner of the basement sat 2 metal tables, and on them lay what remained of Emma Rodriguez and Kayla Chen. But they weren't dead, not entirely. Tubes and wires snaked from their bodies to an elaborate apparatus that hummed with electrical current. Their chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, and their eyes, though vacant, occasionally tracked movement. Sarah had to grip the wall to keep from falling. This was so much worse than death. A voice emerged from the shadows, calm and pleasant, as if commenting on the weather. "You're earlier than I expected." Dr. Harrison Whitmore stepped into the light, his white hair perfectly combed despite the underground setting. He wore a surgical gown over his clothes, stained with substances Sarah didn't want to identify. In his hands, he carried a leather-bound journal, pages filled with meticulous handwriting. "Dr. Whitmore," Sarah managed, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. "Step away from the girls." "Girls?" Whitmore chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "These aren't girls anymore, Detective. There's something far more remarkable. 15 years of research, 15 years of failed attempts, and finally, I've achieved sustainable consciousness transfer." Webb's recorder captured every word as Whitmore continued his monologue, seemingly unaware of the horror surrounding him. "The human brain is remarkably resilient when properly maintained. Remove the unnecessary emotional centers, preserve the cognitive functions, and you have a perfect vessel. These two have been conscious for weeks now, experiencing reality through multiple sensory inputs I've provided. They're living in a paradise of my creation." Sarah fought back nausea as she noticed the cables connected to the girls' skulls, leading to a bank of computers that displayed brainwave patterns. "You're keeping them in some kind of virtual reality while their bodies serve science," Whitmore finished. "Every organ regeneration, every tissue sample, every neurological response provides invaluable data. They're contributing to something greater than their mundane teenage lives ever could have achieved." The mechanical breathing of the girls filled the silence that followed. Sarah realized with growing horror that they were aware, trapped in whatever digital nightmare Whitmore had constructed, while their bodies were slowly harvested. "The other victims," Webb whispered, gesturing toward the jars. "How many others?" 43 over the years, Whitmore said with pride. "Though most weren't suitable for extended consciousness preservation. The technology wasn't advanced enough until recently. These two represent the culmination of decades of work." Sarah's radio crackled to life, Sheriff Morrison's voice urgent and distorted. "Sarah, you need to get out of there. We found 3 more cabins connected by underground tunnels. This whole section of the mountain is honeycombed with his facilities." Whitmore's expression shifted, the pleasant facade cracking to reveal something predatory beneath. "You've brought quite an investigation team, haven't you? No matter. I have contingency plans." He moved toward a control panel, and Sarah realized the girl's life support systems were connected to it. One switch, and whatever remained of Emma and Kayla would be gone forever. "Don't move," Sarah commanded, drawing her weapon. But Whitmore was already reaching for the controls. "They're already gone, Detective. What you see here are merely biological machines running on borrowed time. The real Emma and Kayla exist in a digital realm where pain doesn't touch them." His finger hovered over a red switch labeled Emergency Termination. "But if you insist on disrupting my work, I suppose it's time to begin the final phase of the experiment." The basement door creaked open, revealing a narrow wooden staircase that descended into absolute darkness. Sheriff Martinez's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stale air. Behind her, Detective Brooks checked his weapon one final time, while Dr. Sarah Chen clutched the medical kit she'd insisted on bringing. "Stay close," Martinez whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling sounds of the old cabin. "And whatever we find down there, remember, we need to document everything." The first step groaned under Martinez's weight, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire structure. As they descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and an acrid smell began to permeate the air, a mixture of chemical preservatives and something organic that made Chen cover her nose with her sleeve. The basement was larger than the cabin's footprint suggested, extending beyond what should have been possible. Martinez's flashlight swept across concrete walls that glistened with moisture, revealing a space that had been carefully modified and expanded. But it was what occupied the center of the room that made all 3 investigators freeze in horrified silence. A surgical table dominated the space, its metal surface stained with dark patches that told a story none of them wanted to read. Surrounding it were instruments that belonged in no legitimate medical facility, crude devices that spoke of experimentation rather than healing. But these weren't what had broken young Tommy Brennan's mind. Along the far wall stood a series of glass containers, each roughly the size of a person, filled with a murky preservative solution. Martinez's light moved slowly from one to the next, revealing shapes that defied immediate comprehension. At first glance, they appeared to be anatomical specimens, but as the beam lingered, the truth became horrifyingly clear. "My God," Brooks whispered, his voice cracking. "What is that?" The first container held what had once been Emma Hartley, though calling it by her name felt like a desecration. Her body had been modified. Additional limbs had been grafted onto her torso with surgical precision, creating something that was neither fully human nor entirely other. Her face, preserved in chemical suspension, bore an expression of eternal terror. Chen stumbled backward, her medical training warring with her human revulsion. "This isn't possible. The level of surgical skill required, the equipment needed." Martinez forced herself to examine the next container, where Madison Cross floated in similar circumstances. But where Emma had been given extra appendages, Madison appeared to have had parts removed and replaced with mechanical components, a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal that suggested experiments in cybernetic enhancement. "There are more," Brooks said, his flashlight revealing additional containers further along the wall. Some held partial remains, others displayed modifications so extreme that identification would require dental records. But it was the empty containers that proved most chilling, 6 of them, waiting for new occupants. A sound from above made all 3 investigators freeze. Footsteps crossed the cabin floor, slow and deliberate. Martinez motioned for silence, but it was too late. A voice called down from the darkness above, cultured and calm. "I wondered when you'd find your way down there. Please, don't let me interrupt your examination." Dr. Marcus Everly descended the stairs with the casual air of a host greeting dinner guests. In the flashlight beams, his appearance was shockingly normal, a middle-aged man in a cardigan sweater, his grey hair neatly combed, wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh light. "You're under arrest," Martinez began, but Everly raised a hand to stop her. "Of course I am, but surely you have questions first. After all, you've stumbled upon work that's taken me decades to perfect." His eyes gleamed with pride as he gestured toward the containers. "Each modification teaches me something new about the boundaries of human adaptation." Chen found her voice, though it shook with rage. "You tortured these girls. This isn't science, it's murder." "Murder?" Everly seemed genuinely puzzled. "They're not dead, Dr. Chen. Suspended animation was the first technique I mastered. They're quite alive, preserved at the moment of their greatest transformation. In a sense, they've achieved immortality." The casual tone with which he discussed his atrocities made Brooks's finger tighten on his weapon's trigger. "The mountain boy, Tommy. What did you do to him?" "Nothing at all. Poor child simply wasn't prepared for the revelation that humanity's next evolutionary step requires guidance. He saw my work and couldn't comprehend its beauty." Everly moved closer to one of the containers, placing an affectionate hand on the glass. "But you're professionals. Surely you can appreciate the artistry involved." Martinez's radio crackled as backup units announced their arrival above. The sound seemed to break whatever spell Everly's calm demeanor had cast over the basement. His expression shifted, becoming cold and calculating. "I suppose our conversation is concluded then," he said, reaching into his cardigan pocket. "Such a pity. There was so much more I wanted to show you." The syringe appeared in his hand like a magician's trick, its needle gleaming as he raised it toward his own neck. The confession tape crackled through the station speakers one final time as Sheriff Morrison switched off the recorder. Detective Sarah Chen sat across from him, her face pale in the fluorescent light. Between them lay photographs, evidence bags, and the twisted truth of what had happened on Devil's Ridge. 17 years, Morrison said, his voice hoarse. 17 years we've been looking for those girls." Chen picked up one of the photographs. The cabin interior, walls streaked with something dark and organic. And all this time they were never missing at all. The real horror wasn't what they'd found in that cabin, it was what they hadn't found. Tommy Brewster's confession had unraveled everything. Sitting in his hospital bed, speaking in a monotone voice while staring at nothing, he'd told them about following the screams that night 3 weeks ago, about finding the cabin that local maps insisted didn't exist, about what he'd discovered inside. But Tommy had been wrong about one crucial detail, the thing he'd found wearing Emily Patterson's face. It wasn't Emily. It had never been Emily. "Play the last part again," Chen said. Morrison's finger hesitated over the button. They'd listened to it 6 times already, but Chen needed to hear it once more, the part where everything clicked into place. The tape resumed with Tommy's hollow voice. "It looked right at me with Emily's eyes, but they were wrong somehow. Like someone had put on a mask but couldn't figure out how the expressions worked. And then it smiled with too many teeth and said, 'Thank you for finding us. We've been so lonely up here, just the 2 of us. Playing pretend gets tiresome after so long.'" Chen closed her eyes. 2 of us. The Jessica thing was there too. Tommy continued on the recording, standing in the corner watching. "But when I looked closer, I could see where the skin was pulling away from its face, like it didn't fit right, like a costume that was too small." Morrison stopped the tape again. "The medical examiner's report came back this morning." Chen looked up. "And?" "The biological samples we took from the cabin walls, they're not human. Close, but not human. Something that's trying very hard to be human, but doesn't quite understand how." Outside, snow began falling on Devil's Ridge, the same mountain that had guarded its secrets for decades. The same mountain where 2 teenage girls had supposedly vanished without a trace 17 years ago. Except they hadn't vanished. They'd never existed at all. "The school records," Chen said suddenly. "Pull them again." Morrison frowned. "We already checked." "No, not their enrollment. Their interactions. Who else remembered them? Who else claimed to be their friends?" 20 minutes later, they had their answer. The web was larger than they'd imagined. Emily Patterson and Jessica Walsh had been popular girls, according to everyone who remembered them. They'd had dozens of friends, been involved in multiple activities, dated several boys. But when Morrison and Chen started making calls, tracking down those supposed friends and boyfriends, they found something impossible. None of them existed either. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, staring at the list. "How many of them are there?" The pattern was always the same. People remembered these individuals clearly, could describe them in detail, swore they'd been close friends. But there were no birth certificates, no family histories, no paper trails of any kind, just collective memories of people who had never been born. Chen's phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for St. Mary's Hospital. "Tommy's awake," the nurse reported. "But Detective, there's something else. Something he keeps saying that we thought you should know." "What is it?" "He keeps asking about his sister. Says he has to warn his sister. But according to his medical records, Tommy Brewster is an only child. He's never had a sister." Chen's blood went cold. She looked at Morrison, who'd heard every word. "What's his sister's name?" Chen asked. "Melody. He says her name is Melody Brewster. Pretty girl, he says. Popular at school. Everyone loves her." After hanging up, Chen and Morrison sat in silence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere on Devil's Ridge, things that weren't quite human continued their long game of pretending to be what they could never truly become. "How long do you think they've been doing this?" Chen finally asked. Morrison looked at the evidence spread before them, proof of a presence that could implant memories, create false histories, masquerade as human for years at a time. "I don't know. But I think we need to start checking missing persons cases going back a lot further than 17 years. As if summoned by his words, Chen's computer chimed with an incoming email. The subject line read, "Additional missing persons, Devil's Ridge area." The attachment contained 47 names spanning 6 decades, and every single one of them, according to the people who remembered them, had been popular, well-liked, and impossible to forget.